Hi, everybody. I'm Paul Yeager. This is the MTOM Show podcast, a production of Iowa PBS and the Market to Market TV show. You know, there's never a shortage when it comes to the livestock industry. And the last couple of years, if you go back to 2020, that's not even where the story started. There was a trend developing in 2019 that we are still dealing with. A recent report by USDA laid out how animals are moving and disappearing. Not necessarily one of those mysterious conspiracy things, but they're headed to the market and we've been eating them. There's been a strong demand for beef. And what does that mean long term? What are the factors that are playing into you going to the grocery store and having a selection of fresh food? We're going to talk about that and the economics of how that got there, but also the struggles that those in the middle that do the feeding for input costs. And we're also going to discuss those decisions at the feedlot or the cow-calf level about turning that bull out and seeing what's happening. Derrell Peel, who better than Oklahoma State University Extension agribusiness and agroeconomy discussion? That's what we're going to have today with Derrell. Always a good chat, always a good time, and very insightful here as we get into the dynamics, especially, well, you know me, I can't escape the weather, and that's going to be a big part of today's discussion. So here we go. We're going to school. Ag Economics with Derrell Peel. All right, Derrell, we were just before we started rolling, I was asking you about the weather. What is it with Oklahoma and ice that strikes fear in everyone?
You know, this state, I grew up in Montana so, dealing with snow and winter weather was not a big deal. But honestly, the ice that tends to happen down here is much worse than anything you could have up north. It's so much more debilitating. Plus, we don't get a lot of winter weather, so we're really not equipped to handle it. I think it's a combination of those two things, but you really can't do anything when you lay down that glare ice.
Yeah.
It just brings everything to a halt. And normally it doesn't stay cold for very long. So that's the difference between Oklahoma and Montana from a cattle perspective is, up there, you learn how to deal with it. You got to work in it, you feed in it, you got to be out in it. Down here, you typically just hunker down and wait it out. And 24, 36 hours, it's gone most of the time. But when it doesn't do that, then it's really a problem for our guys. And so this has been a challenge.
Those animals have a little thicker coats up in Montana than they do in Oklahoma.
Yeah, they do. They get used to it. And so that can also really be an issue, especially if we get early season storms and our cattle are not haired up yet. And so they can really suffer a lot in this.
You mentioned Montana is your home. How did you what did you grow up in doing? Was it always been cattle, or were you one of those guys that you had different visions as a kid?
No, and I should say, I actually started out life in West Texas, but my dad wanted out of row crop farming. He wanted to raise some cattle. So when I was a little tyke, we moved to Western Montana, and he bought a little place, and we raised cattle and hay, basically, and he worked off the farm some too. And so that's what I grew up. I was always around cattle my whole life, and I've been interested in it. So that's been my whole life, as well as my whole professional career. Has been the cattle. I've been in Oklahoma now 35 years, almost 34, I guess. So I've been here a long time, but it's always been about cattle.
Do you think the rest of the country has caught up to the fact that Oklahoma is more of a cattle state than Texas? Come on, let's throw some shade at Texas right here.
Well, it is a big cattle state. And, in some ways, I have made the argument in the past that proportional to our size, the cattle industry is very important here. The stocker cattle part of that industry is particularly important. One of the things I've done in my career is work a lot with the stocker industry. And it's been unique because when I left Montana, I didn't know what the stocker industry was. And I think there's still some challenge. Most cattle up north are born in the spring, they leave in the fall, and they go somewhere, but we don't necessarily know where always. And you just don't do a lot of that because there's just too much winter. And so I had to learn about the stocker industry when I first moved back to the Southern Plains. And it's been a lot of fun really learning the role of that and the importance of that. And then, of course, here in the Southern Plains, most years we have wheat pasture in the wintertime. That's a fairly unique thing. And it actually plays a pretty important role nationwide in cattle markets because we provide a home for a lot of cattle from the southeast or from maybe from up north at that time of the year when there isn't a lot of things to graze.
Well, and I had heard late last summer that there was concern that Oklahoma was going to be a little different place for cattle because of the dry conditions, and maybe not as many cattle were going to. Maybe some cattle were coming from Texas, but there were going to be some offloading farther east where there was rain. Did that end up happening?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, we just got the USDA's semi-annual cattle inventory numbers, and the impact of the drought is very evident in there in terms of what we expected, not only on a nationwide basis but regionally. Oklahoma, actually, if you look at the all cattle and calves inventory, Oklahoma had the biggest reduction year over year of any state. So we lost something like 600,000 head of cattle last year in total, which was, I think, twice what Texas lost. And so yeah, the impacts here in Oklahoma have been very, very, very severe, and continue to be, frankly, because we're still in the drought. And right now we're having a lot of cold weather. We have, like everywhere else in the country, we have limited hay stocks. So we got a lot of guys that are still trying to figure out how they're going to get through the winter, let alone what spring conditions are going to look like.
Do you think it's a temporary reduction? That maybe some of these cattle did go somewhere else and will come back? Or is this a sign of, yes, there has been liquidation of herds?
Well, we've clearly liquidated the herd. In fact, if you look again at the USDA numbers nationwide, we lost over 1 million head of cows last year, which is the biggest, in terms of absolute numbers, the biggest year over year decrease in the beef cow herd since like 1986. So, and one of the things about this drought this time has been that it's been much more widespread across the country. So, we had a drought 10 years ago that was very severe in Texas and Oklahoma, but outside of that region, not so much. And there were a lot of cattle, in addition to the ones that were net liquidated, there were a lot of cattle that were relocated to new homes during that time period. This time, I don't think we've had as much relocation because there just weren't a lot of places that had a lot better conditions, frankly.
Mm.
And so there's been, cow slaughter was enormous last year. In fact, the last 2 years, as was heifer slaughter. And so the level of female liquidation across the country, and in particular in these drought regions, has been very, very significant and will impact us for several years as we go forward.
Well, you just gave me the facts. Give me the impact then.
Well, the impacts are, sort of twofold. One is 2022 was all-time record beef production in the U.S. And when you look at the cyclical nature of cattle inventories, cow herd and the all cattle inventory peaked in 2019. We've been getting smaller. How did we have beef production that many years later? Well, the reason we had peak all-time record beef production in 2022 is because we were eating that inventory. That's a temporary thing that you can do or have to do when you're in the middle of drought forced liquidation, but it's not sustainable. Obviously, that's not an ongoing proposition. And the other, so that's that's sort of where we are now. Going forward, we have a lot less cattle, and so beef production is going to fall. That's going to impact consumers in ways that they have not seen thus far in this thing. And then, of course, at some point in time, we trust that the drought conditions will improve. We don't know when that's going to be. It hasn't happened yet. But when they do, then we're going to try to rebuild. And that's when we're going to really squeeze beef production, because we're going to need to not eat all those heifers and cows. We're going to save them to rebuild the herd. And that is the kind of thing that really puts a spike in cattle prices for some period of time. We don't know when that's going to happen, but it will happen at some point.
Because it's going to be extremely tempting for a producer to see the price, and when the yard calls and says, hey, we're going to offer this for a price, to not load up a load and send them to market. But for the good and health of the organization, or for the industry long term, you got to keep some of those animals back, right? That's it, right? Is that too oversimplifying it?
No, well, no, I think that is exactly, the dilemma, if you will. And it's the nature of the cattle industry that makes it kind of unique, even compared to other livestock markets, is that, it's a one-for-one proposition. In order to invest in future production, you got to not eat that heifer now. You got to not send her to the feed lot and feed her out. And it's not like the swine industry where you can save one gilt and a year later you get 20 pigs. In the case of the beef industry, you save one heifer and 2 years later you get one calf. So it's a much slower process and it kind of exaggerates those times when we have too much or not enough. Is that you're either eating your way out of excess inventory or you're making a tight supply even tighter. And so, yeah, that's what's ahead for us here at some point, is that we're gonna make this thing a lot tighter, and the market prices are gonna reflect that in terms of providing the incentives that producers will need to want to save those heifers and invest in that future production.
But it gets down to dollars and cents in one way, Derrell, is that when you have a 6 in front of that corn market, that price, that makes it pretty expensive to feed. And then you're going to have a consumer who's going to look at the price up on the board of their butcher or their meat producer and go, "That's not a number I'm going to afford or buy."
That's right. It's going to be really interesting to see how this thing plays out. Cattle prices, from a consumer demand standpoint, beef demand has stayed remarkably strong through this whole pandemic thing, all the disruptions that we've had, and through the fact that we've had large supplies of beef. So prices have stayed high, which says that beef demand has been strong. But now we're talking about when there's less beef, we're going to tighten supply. Then those prices are going to be, at least there's going to be pressure to push them higher. And the question is, how much can they go higher? And maybe the question is going to be, how will some consumers probably will get priced out of the market. There won't be as much beef, and markets ration things to make sure we don't run out. So we're going to find out who wants it the most, and we'll price it accordingly. But that's a very difficult issue right now, given the consumers are facing so much inflationary pressures on everything. So that's one end of it. That's going to be kind of the cap on the upper end. The bottom end is we've got this really tight supply scenario developing here. So what it means is the guys in the middle, you mentioned the price of corn, all of the margin operations above the cow-calf level are going to be really squeezed in this process, because the top side of the market will adjust at least somewhat, but it won't adjust fast as the bottom side is coming up. And so I think cattle feeding is going to be a dilemma going forward here, because we're going to have not as many feeder cattle. They're going to be really expensive. And then we've still got a high cost of gain in terms of high feed prices. And so those margins are going to be a challenge going forward.
And the problem is the middle is where a lot of beginning producers kind of enter the game. And that's always the producer you worry about on a possible contraction or dramatic price swings. They're the ones who can't quite weather it. Their pencil isn't as long as someone else.
Yeah, that's right. It's a question of who's going to make these adjustments. That's a question in terms of the type of producer. There's some regional implications when you think about you think about high cost of production and how high do these prices have to go again to provide the incentive to rebuild. That's got to come out of the cow-calf sector. That's the factory, of course, that all the supply comes from. But when you think about where cattle are produced, they're produced all over the country. Cows are, because we eat wherever there's forage, right? But in the eastern half of the country, that tends to be where we have, these introduced grasses that require fertilizer and lots of inputs, relative to the west, where we have rangelands that don't require near as many inputs. So we may see some regional differences in how the industry responds going forward, and sort of who can respond, or who can respond at least the quickest in all of this process.
I've never thought of this until right now, but you're speaking. You make it sound like I'm watching an election night coverage. When we talk about bellwether counties, there's election prognosticators that say, well, in Tama County, this has happened, which means the election's going to go this way. Are there bellwether counties for you that you look at when you study all the things you've just been talking about to give you an indication of what may transpire in the market on any level?
Yeah, I think, part of it is just sort of where cattle production tends to take place. And so if you think about where the cows are, they are produced all over the country, and there's some very important cattle production in lots of regions. But obviously, the bulk of the cows are in the middle of the country, right? So from Texas to North Dakota, you got about 40% of the beef cow herd, and so you're going to watch those counties just because they're so those states, I should say, just because they're so big, and what's happening. And of course, that's where the drought's laying the worst right now, across Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, and parts of Texas. And so what happens there is really going to dictate what happens in the rest of the country from the standpoint of that fundamental supply, from a cow-calf standpoint. Then once you take it up to the feedlot level, we got to watch the feed side of the market as well as the cattle side, the feeder cattle side of the market. And so that shifts it a little bit. One of the things that came out of this latest cattle inventory number, for many years, most of the time, Texas has been the largest cattle feeding state in terms of numbers on January 1, although about 10, 15 years ago, when the sort of ethanol thing took off, there was a period of time where Nebraska was a little bigger than Texas again. And then it's kind of shifted back to Texas. But I noticed in these numbers that Nebraska and Texas were actually tied on January 1 for all cattle. So there are those regional impacts in terms of where cattle are going to be produced and where the resources are, and maybe how those resources are going to get used in the future.
And I think of the conversation I had with a producer in Kansas yesterday who talked to a friend who's in western Kansas who just said, they have planted, my friend, wheat on wheat that's not grown. I have 2 years of 2 crops of seed sitting in dry dirt. So there's no hope for them on a winter crop for this year coming. And when you talk about spread over an entire region, when you hear stories of, well, we can't even grow anything that will be used in 3 months from now, does that give you pause for concern?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, when you look at it, especially seasonally, again, the southern plains and the wheat pasture grazing thing that's kind of unique to this region. Normally, our numbers in Oklahoma, I mentioned earlier, were way down. And if you do the estimated feeder supply calculation, which would capture those cattle that are out on pasture someplace or whatever, our feeder supply estimated for the state of Oklahoma was down 18.5%, I think. We didn't have much of a wheat pasture grazing. We've got a few cattle in the southern part of the state. There's a little bit of wheat pasture, but way less than normal in the northern half of the state. And that's going to go up into Kansas as well, in the region where they would typically graze. And so, so that, again, that has an impact not only on those states, but it also impacts the rest of the country, because we provide a home for those cattle. As we measure it, we know that cattle flow in here from other states, and those states, some of them have learned over the years that what our conditions are is going to have an impact on their markets, and that's certainly been true.
Is there anybody that wins with this report from yesterday? And when I say win, is it a consumer? Is it a feeder? Is it a cow-calf? Who has the best outlook in 23?
In terms of prices, it's pretty clear that the cow-calf sector is going to be in the driver's seat, because this report confirms that we're smaller than we need to be as an industry. There's a market that's bigger than what we can actually service right now, and we're not sure that we're done liquidating yet. So it may get even more dramatic, and so that means that the market's focus is gonna go back to the cow-calf sector to encourage that increase in production that we need. And that comes from rebuilding the herd first, so that you can increase beef production. So the cow-calf sector, from a price standpoint, now, if you're in the middle of a drought and you had to get rid of your cows, that doesn't help in the short run, right? So it kind of depends on which cow-calf producer you are and where you are in the country. But as a sector, the cow-calf sector is clearly going to be in the driver's seat from that standpoint. As I mentioned earlier, the margin sectors are going to struggle. I think the feedlot sector is going to have some real challenges. Packers are going to have a lot of challenges. We've talked a lot in the last few years about packers have had opportunities to make a lot of money, and that happens sometimes in that sector. They're going to give a bunch of it back in the next 2 years or 3.
Well, and they already have. We already saw a big reversal in about 6-8 months.
From that's right.
Huge margins to no margin.
Their margins were down, and they're going to get a lot tighter even going forward. And then ultimately, this tight supply and all of that is going to go to the consumer level. So, consumers are not going to get any relief. Again, there may be limits on how high we can push those retail prices, because of the challenges for consumers, but we're clearly going to push them as hard as we can. And I think the end result is that they will in fact go somewhat higher, with the implications that has for, again, for different consumers, and who wants it the most, who can afford it, and what kinds of adjustments will they make on the types of products maybe that they're able or willing to buy in that environment.
Well, and let's be honest. The consumer is in a kind of a pinch spot when you keep hearing about HPAI influencing the poultry market, and all of a sudden chicken hasn't dropped to a price, and that has gone expensive. So we went over to the beef market because hamburger was cheap, and then oh wait, now pork is. There's a couple of factors and major sources of protein for the American consumer that are kind of heading into that vice grip of sorts. Do you see any relief in any livestock industry that might benefit more?
From a consumer standpoint, again, we're looking, in fact, if you look at the projections for 2023 for, beef production dropping, pork production may be more stable, but it has been dropping somewhat. Poultry also, relatively stable. Some impact on the meat side, but actually the biggest impact in poultry from HPAI was on the eggs, and there's been a lot of talk about egg prices, and that's one of the protein sources that consumers can turn to. So across the board, projections for this year for total meat production in the U.S. are for the first decrease that we will have seen in about 7 or 8 years. So we've generally seen increasing meat supplies. Now, of course, we have to adjust that for trade in all of those sectors, the net flows of products in and out of the country. But the bottom line is we're going to see less meat total in the country. So I think your point is well taken, that there's not necessarily going to be any obvious alternative out there across the protein sectors. I think it's going to be a challenge and a bit of an issue for consumers.
When it shows up on the front page of the mainstream press, that's when we because the eggs has been in there, and then there's the report of, well, there really wasn't a supply demand issue. That was just a profit taking opportunity by those companies. I won't make you answer that question, but I will make you answer. But I am going to make you answer this as we wind down just a little bit. As you look at livestock and the consumer, it's been. Is there a stomach for the non-farm related person to see expansion of livestock? Because you hear about people in ag states that don't want more confinement operations, or they don't want another feedlot, or they don't want another beef processing facility. All these discussions have really re-energized in the last couple of years. Is there a stomach for the consumer to understand this more and maybe realize, okay, yeah, we do need more of X or Y?
Well, and I think that kind of gets to the point. As a country, I think we've enjoyed abundant, relatively cheap food compared to most of the world for a long, long time. And it's certainly easy in that environment to sort of take it for granted. And so then you start these kinds of conversations about the things that maybe we don't like or whatever, without necessarily understanding the implications. So I guess I say all that to say that if we get into a situation where maybe food is either not as abundant or not as cheap, then then the reality comes home that, hey, there are some things that have to get done in order for us to have those advantages. And so there may be more of those conversations in the future. I think we're still in a good position to continue producing abundant, relatively cheap food for the American consumer. But it's certainly, and the pandemic really demonstrated what happens when you seriously disrupt these supply chains and things. All of a sudden, whoa, maybe at least temporarily, things weren't as available, or the range of products wasn't as available for a brief period of time. And that just highlights the fact that we can have problems where it becomes a much more fundamental question of eating, rather than maybe some of these other questions that are, a little bit more philosophical in nature, if you will, or whatever, not related to the underlying issue of just making sure that we have lots of food for everybody that needs it.
Politically, we're getting ready to work maybe on a new farm bill. We think that's what's going to happen. Depends on what political source you read.
Right.
But on a policy sense, there's been beef state senators. I can think of Nebraska and Iowa, Kansas, have all been involved with the politics side before the farm bill about the packer margin, really what prompted a lot of that, and the fair market price and the understanding spot price and things like that. Do you think there's still going to be a stomach for that to move politically forward on any of those? I mean, especially if the packer isn't going to be making money like they were.
Well, yeah, I think there's a couple things. One is high cattle prices takes care of a lot of those discussions, and so we've seen this come and go. These issues are not new. We've been talking about them for as long as I've been in this business. At various times, they come and go, and so I think there'll be less of that just because we're going to be in an environment here for the next 2 to 4 years at least of relatively high cattle prices, and that takes care of some of that. But it won't go away either because again, we've been here before, and it never completely goes away. I would just say that whatever we decide to do from a policy standpoint, by the way, I can't predict politics. I can't figure out cattle markets, let alone politics. But so I wouldn't attempt to predict what's going to happen. But I guess, here's where it comes down to for me. I have argued for many years, and I really believe it's true that the U.S. cattle and beef industry, as it operates today, is probably the most complex set of markets on the planet. When you take all of the dimensions of complexity in this industry, I don't think there's another industry anywhere that can match it. And what that does to me then is it really highlights the fact that we need to let markets work. There's just too many pieces and moving parts and too much dynamics in this thing. If we start interfering, any kind of government solution to a problem is going to inject into a market and disrupt the way markets work. And I really think we better be very careful about how we do that if we're going to do that. And that's my advice, I guess, to the industry in general is be careful if you think that's where the solution lies, because I think it's more complicated than maybe those simple, easy to understand solutions would let you think about.
I'm not going to put a word in your mouth, but are you saying status quo?
I'm saying the market does a remarkable job.
Yeah.
If you think about the fact that any consumer in the country can go into a grocery store any day of the year and find fresh meat, fresh beef that's probably not more than 2 or 3 weeks from having been harvested, and yet the process that led to that fresh meat being available for that consumer started 2.5 years ago by some guy 1,000 miles away in many cases or more, deciding to turn the bull out. Now, when you think about all the things that happen from the time you turn the bull out until you've got fresh meat available 365 days a year for consumers, I think you have to be really impressed that markets do a remarkably good job of making sure that we don't ever really have issues of walking into the store and there's nothing there available for us today. And so I think markets do an awfully good job of solving a lot of issues along the way.
Never a dull moment and no shortage of things to talk about, Derrell.
Boy, that's for sure.
Derrell, I appreciate the time. Thank you so very much for the conversation.
Yeah, you bet. I've enjoyed it very much. Anytime I can help.
My thanks to Derrell Peel for his time and insight. New episodes of this podcast come out each and every Tuesday. You can find it wherever you get your podcasts, or you can watch the YouTube version on our YouTube channel. Subscribe and follow today and always be in the know. We'll see you next time.